Okay, I've installed maptools, and this is the first video on how to use the NSDM campaign that I've prepared for this program. So first I'm going to go to the batch file to launch it, double click. This is using 1200 megabytes of RAM, which is pretty much the minimum for the maps I've decided to use. Some of the older or smaller laptops might have an issue with that, just to give you a heads up. And maptools is up, and since this is a brand new installation, there are a few things I have to do for this to be comfortable with the way we're using it. So first we go to Edit and Preferences. Start Snap to Grid, we want that turned off. Facing, on edges and on vertices, that probably won't matter much, but we may as well. Show dialog on new token, we want this unchecked, but I'm not going to change it yet, because I'm going to show you how that works if you don't uncheck it. And then we need to change our windows. I'm going to remove most of these. And that just leaves us with our campaign macros. I haven't loaded a campaign yet, so there are no macros loaded yet. The chat window and the library. The chat window, theoretically, we could use this to push news updates. But at the moment, there's nothing stopping players from also pushing news updates here, so that would get a little bit awkward. I haven't done much work on this. Theoretically, I could improve it later. I'm closing chat. For the resource library, again, this is something you would need to do only when you first install the program. I'm going to go to File, Add Resource to Library. And when we pull this up, in whatever directory you installed maptools, I included a library subdirectory. You need to load that and install it. And that will give you all of the tokens and images that I loaded to help your life become much easier. Then, now that we've done this, we need to open the actual campaign. Again, that's in the maptools folder that you installed. It's just NSDM version 1 campaign. And that's going to take a minute to load. And down here you can see the macros that were loaded. The legacy one you can just ignore. But F2 and F3 are for when you first create the token, and for when you need to modify its in-game status, like with supplies or combat effectiveness. And I'm going to change maps, actually. That's not the map I want to start at. Okay. And this right here is a library token. The only reason it exists is to store variables that my macros need to call. So ignore that, don't touch it, don't do anything to it. It just needs to sit there. The rest of these are all the tokens I created for the various land, air, and sea units. There are formation sizes for every one of these, and I'll show you more of what you can do with that later. But let's start with a standard generic token. So we go, let's say a carrier. And the normal size for a carrier is 2x's. This is the new dialog window that we don't want to see, so we'll uncheck that because it's really annoying. And now we can just drag and drop. And what happens is that all of these tokens have been pre-configured as a generic token. It shows the branch, the number of ships, the personnel, the name of that formation size. And when you get a token, what you want to do is click on a single one and press F2, and that will take you to the input values. So we're going to name this USS Enterprise, label US Navy, carrier battle group, base Norfolk, branch is Navy by default, and it's by default for sea ships. It's different for air and land. It's not stealth, it's not reserve, and its flag is US Navy. And that just changed that into a US Navy carrier. If I press F2 again, the same information will be preloaded. It doesn't have any danger of accidentally resetting the token. If I click on the status tab, I can also set supply, combat effectiveness, and very brief notes. F3 does the same thing as F2, except it loads the status tab first, just as a convenience factor. Other than that, they're exactly the same. If you need longer notes stored on a token, you can double left click, and that'll bring up this notes window, where you can type things like the default composition of the carrier force. So something like that. Also, this is a feature that will almost certainly never be used, but if you right-click, you can go to Set Facing, and that gives you a little yellow arrow, which you can point in different directions. And that's really not worth the trouble of doing, but it exists. Now, when you create one token like this, any changes you make only apply to that one token. If, for example, you think my helicopter sizes are wrong, or my submarine sizes are wrong, what you want to do is you want to go to these generic tokens I left available, and let's find a good example. For starters, helicopters. By default, all helicopters are assigned to the Air Force branch. When I was doing a practice map, I noticed that most of them are assigned to Army. Now, I usually change the branch manually, but that's one more annoying thing. If you wanted to, you could go in here, right-click, edit, go to the Properties tab, and you could change the branch to Army. You could change the number of personnel or the number of aircraft or the name of that size of helicopter formation. And once you've made all the changes you like, what you do is you right-click, you go to Save, you go to the maptools directory, to Library, to the folder where that specific unit is stored, and you hit Save. And if you do that, these files over here in the library will be changed to show your preferred default stats. That only applies to new units you create, not to the old ones I already placed, but it's a very helpful feature. And for the old units, you would either have to delete them and redo them, or modify each manually, or if it was a really big project and you asked nicely, I could probably write a macro to do it automatically. Other things you need to know is that by default, Marines are assigned to the Army. Marines to the Army. Obviously, if you have a naval aircraft, it's not Air Force, it's Navy. You'll have to change it. And another thing is that ships are grouped as ships or boats, and other than that, they have exactly the same stats. So we have boats here. That's the increment for hovercraft boats. I forgot to set a number of boats for National Navy hovercraft. No one. And Then for other ships, it's just one ship, 76 personnel, 230, 700, then 3 ships, 2100 on up. Problem being that, say, carriers and submarines use the same interval, but while you want, say, one carrier with 700 personnel, you don't want one sub with 700 personnel, you want 6 subs with 100 personnel each. So if that sort of detail bothers you, you would have to adjust the numbers for the subs and then save each of the subs, and that would make a change in the future. Also, the ballistic missiles, I didn't have any numbers for how many missiles went to each formation size, so I just used the same as numbers I had for Air Force. And that's the basic of how to create a token and how to save changes to future tokens. And I'll go ahead and show you how to create a map. So we're going to New Map, and I'm going to name this Balkans 1. And what we want to do is select the background layer. And I previously loaded a map of Central Balkans. This is a CIA map that's not classified and available freely. It's being hosted at University of Texas Library simply because they have a better file size than the CIA website did. So I can drag it over here and drop it in the map, and in a moment it will load. And now this is in the background. If I hold down Shift, I can click in the bottom right and adjust its size. If I do not hold down Shift, there's nothing keeping it proportional. I can also spin it in circles if I hold down Shift and use the mouse wheel, which is just annoying. I'm going to go ahead and drop in another carrier and hit F2. The last carrier I created was US Navy, so it defaults to US Navy this time. Unless there were already a flag set, then it would use whatever flag the token currently had. And I'm going to actually claim this is the Israeli Navy, because I can. And it's still a carrier. It's called an escort carrier. Oops. And I accidentally just set the map to be as an Israeli carrier. Sorry. I'll go ahead and ignore that for now and just create a new map, because I needed to show this to you anyway. And I'll name this Balkans 2. Oops. And when I go to name the map, if I just click on the map icon, I can just load any map file I previously had saved. And this time I am unable to select the map or resize it. It's integral to the background, which prevents accidents from messing up your map. But if you wanted to have two maps showing slightly different things, you would still have to drag and drop and put them relative to each other. Now if we switch back to the token layer this time, which is where you usually should be set, I'm going to drop a carrier, set to Israel, because Israel was last time. Let's say Russia. Now there's a Russian Navy carrier. And what I want to do is I want to adjust the grid size of this map. So if you zoom out, I can go Map. Let's go View, Show Coordinates, View, Show Grid. And this shows the current coordinates for each grid square and the position of each grid square. By default, all new tokens are the size of one square. What I want to do is I want to resize those grids to be about 10 miles. So I'm going to go to Adjust Grid, and I'm going to reduce. This is the number of pixels. Too small. That's about right. And now, so that's the size of the grid, and then I need to go to Edit Map and tell it what distance each grid represents, and it's 10 miles. It doesn't label it as miles, so you have to know and preferably be consistent about using kilometers or miles so you don't get confused. And now, when I move this token, it'll show me that I moved it about 50 miles. If you want really large grid squares, because you're using the coordinate systems a lot, what you would have to do is change the grid size. Let's take this up to, say, 100. But then you would have to set the token size so that it's smaller than the grid, so that it doesn't take up the entire map. And if the normal range of sizes available in the drop-down menu aren't sufficient, you can also write a macro to change that size, and I could include that if it became a feature that we needed. However, when you change the size of an individual token, any future tokens you add are still going to be medium-sized, which is one reason you might need a macro. And I'm going to set those back to size medium. And that's the basic map making. And now I'm going to transition to a map I already prepared. And this is a huge map of the entire world with all modern units placed based on the token files I got from Mark. And it does take a while to load. And down in the right you can see how much RAM this is taking up. And we're still loading. Here we go. And I'm going to turn off the grid coordinates because that just annoys me. If somebody else has a use for it, they can always turn it back on. And we've got the entire world map when you zoom out. And there are tokens placed all over for every nation that we know about in the files we've currently developed. Now first, these various text boxes stay the same size as you zoom in or zoom out on them, so they can easily block out the entire map if you go far enough back. Mostly those are just for specific cities or geographic features that were mentioned as token locations that weren't labeled on the map I was using. And as I pointed out, they do get kind of big when you expand. For instance, to create a new one, you go to Drawing Tools, and you click on Text Label, and you can type in. That creates it with a background, and we zoom out and it's the size of half the US. You can also create something without a background, like Gen Con, and that's harder to read, and sometimes you don't notice that it's there, but it's still kind of annoying when you zoom out, because it still stays the same size as the first example. Now if you go back to your selection tool, you can't click on text fields. You have to go back to the text option and click on it, and then hit the delete key. You can also draw. So right here I'm clicking on Draw Straight Lines. I'm adjusting my brush size to something very large. And now I'm drawing. I can also change it to a rectangle. That's black rectangle, white interior. If I right-click on this red line across a white square, that stands for transparent. And now when I do it, it's a transparent background. And if I need to erase, select the rectangle, hold down Shift, and instead of adding a rectangle, it removes anything in the area I had selected because I was holding down Shift. The drawing is also how I added those black lines for the various inset maps. I have inset maps for Israel, Korea, Taiwan Straits, Diego Garcia, and Guam. And let's take a look at China. We're zooming into the Chinese units, and we get to talk about stealth. So let's say we want to give China a small number of stealth fighters which we have ruled that other nations cannot detect. So we go to Fighter Attack, we select a small formation size, we drop it down here, and we hit F2 to create a token. And we can name it whatever, but Stealth Fighter. And what we do is we check this stealth box, and we make certain that we have the flag set to China. And then when we click OK, first that added a stealth flag on top of this token to remind us that it's stealthed. But what it also did, go back to interaction tools. What it also did, because we used the macro, is if you go to Edit, go to Edit, Config, it checked Visible to Owners Only. So only players named China can see this unit because ownership is set to China, which was done when we used the macro to define the flag. Generally, that's why you don't want to go to State and click on Stealth directly, because the macro won't make any changes in the background to reflect it, and that'll just confuse things. The macro is also much more convenient, so you'll probably be using it anyway. And if we go to View, Show as Player, it's letting it see. Alright, because China can see that as a player, we can also see it. So that might be a problem if you needed to hide units when you were having players look over your shoulder. I'll have to see if I can come up with a solution to that. But what we can also do is we can set reserve units. Let's give me land, infantry. And if I just hit F2, say name it infantry reserve, and if I check this reserve box, that adds a reserve flag in the top left, and it does this white checker box thing around the edges. If for some reason I wanted to set it to reserve and stealth at the same time, the stealth flag would be on top, but you'd still have the white checkerboard. And that's mostly just a visual reminder that a unit's designated as being reserved. Let's see, other things you need to learn. Oh yeah, event tokens. If you scroll down to events, I've placed some images in that folder. You can add more images if you have anything you want to show, like a tsunami. What I'll do is first I'll set layer to object and drag and drop this. And it's going to start out really huge because it's a large image. But I'll size that down to something reasonable. And what you can do is if you double left click and go to notes, you can type in any notes that you want displayed to the players. So I just typed in that message and clicked OK. And now when I go back to the token layer, which is where all players are by default, and left click, that message appears along the bottom. And that message can be as long as you need it to be. Other things. You can show token labels. If you hit Control-T, all these labels will automatically be on. You can also do that in View, Show Token Names. The problem is that, like text boxes, it stays the same size, so when you zoom out, everything becomes crazy blurred. So you'll normally want to have all the text boxes turned off. And it's about time to show you how we host for maptools. So to do that, normally you would need a very powerful computer to have two maptools programs open, or else you would need to do absolutely nothing else, only hosting those. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up another copy of maptools on the same computer. And this uses twice as much memory to do it this way. And what I want to do is go to Tools, Lock Player Movement, which means the players will be unable to move tokens whether they own them or not. And then I'm going to go to File, Start Server. We'll name it NSDM, GM. This is version B87 of maptools, which does not support UPnP. It was broken in this build. So you'll have to manually set a port number, and if you're behind a firewall and trying to host across the internet, you'll have to program your firewall to set up port forwarding. But this is on a local area network right now. Presumably most NSDM games will be too, so that shouldn't be a big deal most of the time. We have a GM password set, we have a player password set, and the two important options here are that strict token ownership should be checked, and restricted player impersonation should be checked. And everything else you can just leave unchecked. And we'll go ahead and host that. And right now, the Balkans maps are visible to players, and the NSDM world map is visible to players. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set NSDM world map to be not player visible. And then I'm going to go to Map, Copy Map, which will create a copy which is player visible. I'll have to fix that later. And now with this copy, any changes we make, we can just delete at the end of the game and go back to the original, and it won't be an issue. So as player, I'm going to go ahead and connect to server, and go to the LAN tab. Username is very important. You have to spell your username exactly the same as the country is spelled on the ownership table. There should be a list of all the valid usernames, and if you need anything else, just let me know. If you're a second staff member signing in, you don't want to sign in as a country. You can just sign in as like staff 1 and set your role to GM. And you would have to set your password to staff instead of player, because there are different passwords for GM and player. And we'll type in China and select the server. And now we're connecting. I'll go ahead and close all of these windows. As a player, I don't need them. And right now I'm on the wrong map. As a GM, I could have fixed that by setting all the maps but the one I wanted to be invisible to players. Or I can just go to Tool and force players to current map. And that forced them to go to the map I was on. I'm zooming back in on China. There's that stealth fighter I was looking at. And it's going to take a minute to load on the player side. Here we go. And if I want them to look at exactly what I'm looking at, I can go to Center Players on Current View. Another option is Center Players on Current View Continuous, which is really annoying because when the players are looking somewhere else, like Korea, if I make the slightest change, it forces them to go back to what I was looking at. So normally you just want to use Center Players on Current View once and not set it to Continuous. But for example, right now, they're logged in as China so they can see the Chinese stealth fighter. But if I add another fighter, actually I'll just Control-C, copy and paste a new fighter, and hit F2, and I'm changing the flag to Japan. And when I changed it to Japan, it just disappeared from the Chinese player's view because Chinese players cannot see stealth fighters they do not own. This does mean that, say, Britain, France, and the US can only see their own stealth fighters, they can't see each other's. Theoretically, there could be a way to work around that, but it's not really worth worrying about. And let's see. Also, while players can't move tokens that they own, they can edit them. So there's nothing stopping a player from right-clicking on the reserve file and going to properties and setting personnel to, a ridiculously large number. The two defenses on that are, one, you have to trust your players. Two, you have to figure out that in a 4-hour game they'll have better things to do than figure this out. And lastly, since you just made a copy of the map, you're going to restore everything to defaults as soon as the game is done anyway. Let's see. It's players. Okay, and I think that's everything that you're going to need to know about how to use the basics of maptools as I've configured it. There are lots of more advanced lessons I could be teaching based on any interest and feedback I get into how you can change things or customize things or things I can do for you to make it easier to use once you've requested a feature. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and end this video. Thank you for watching, and please email me back to let me know how this is working.